All right, how's everybody doing today? We've entered into, oh goodness, we've entered into the week that we're going to talk about, chapter 4, right? And it's on social interaction, right? And this is a really important and a really interesting chapter. One of the things that I fell in love with regarding sociology when I was younger. When I was getting my bachelor's degree at the University of Alabama, is how sociology can make sense of our everyday, ordinary, mundane lives, right? Just the stuff that happens around us and how sociology can explain that, right? And this chapter really gets into quite a lot of that, right? So, a lot of this chapter is not about strange, exotic things far removed from your life, but it's really about your everyday, mundane life, right? And explains how you interact with other people, the norms that dictate that, the roles or statuses that you play throughout the day, and the roles and statuses of other people, right, that you interact with, right? So hopefully we're going to make sense of your social world and not just mine too, right? But believe it or not, there's probably a lot of similarities, right? And so let me get to that, right? There are a number of really important concepts at the beginning of this, and we kind of need to get those out of the way, right? And then we'll get into some of the slightly more complicated ideas, right? Really some of the theoretical ideas, right? The chapter starts with a discussion of social structure, right? And every society has social structure, and it's basically like the roles and statuses that we play and how those are related to other people. I'll try to keep this brief, right? But I have a position in society. You have a position in society too, right? And one way to kind of make sense of that is all the roles and statuses that you play, right? I am, of course, a professor, the instructor of this course, but I'm also a father, I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm a citizen of the United States, a citizen of Homewood, right, and so on. And, you might share some of those roles and statuses, but probably not all of them, right? And by virtue of that position in society, that really dictates a lot about what I do every day, how I think, whether I record this video or do something else, and so, for example, I'm a professor, right? And I'm teaching an online course, I'm a instructor for that, right? And that determines that, I have to teach this class and you expect me to teach this class. Part of that's explaining things, even like social interaction to you, right? And making these videos, right? And so there's, basic norms, right? Also for being a son, it means that I treat my father or my mother, if she was still alive, in certain ways, right? And being a father and my kids, and hopefully if you ever run into me out in the free world, right, and you see me with my 8-year-old and my 10-year-old, it's like, yeah, he's acting like a father, and maybe even a good father, right? And so there's all of this, and this is kind of different way of thinking about this. There's all this social order in social interaction, right? It is not the case that I just do whatever I want to every day, right? Or I freely choose, right? Because I get up and, what time I get up kind of determine, by being a dad, and to some extent by being a professor and have to get to work and commute in a certain amount of time, right? The things that I say throughout the day, including this video, are determined by me being a professor, and a particular type of professor, a sociologist, and I'm a criminologist as well. And the way that I think about the world, right? And the same is true for you as a college student. That's a status that you occupy. And boy, you might not think it, but college students see the world, think about the world in ways that are, unlike adults who are working or people who are not in school or even high school students, right? All right, so there's social order in the world, and a lot of that is determined by your position in society, the status. All right, sorry. Maybe I'm beating a dead horse, but let me move on, right? If you take all of these statuses, and it's a little bit confusing because most people would say all the roles that I occupy, right? But we call roles statuses, right? So, I mentioned being a father, being a son, being, we go on and on, being a Christian, being a citizen, being white, being of a certain class position, right? Having a certain ethnicity. Those are positions or statuses. Some of those are achieved statuses, some of those are ascribed status. Attached to each of those statuses is a set of norms and expectations, right? I'm a professor, I give lectures, I make videos and online classes and so on, right? And father, nurturing, caring, pay for things for my kids and so on, right? And that's kind of really, that's what orders that's what orders social interaction. And boy, that's important, right? Because then we know, right? If I come into the class saying, I'm a professor, you expect me to do certain things, and I think I live up to those expectations, right? Whether it's online course or face-to-face, right? Now, not everyone does, right? Like talk about fathers, there are deadbeat fathers, right? And when they violate those norms, there's sanctions, right? They can be jailed for not paying child care, right? People can look down on them for that, right? They can garnish your wages, right? And those are all the obvious sanctions. If you do not live up to people's expectations, the norm, particularly of the state of Alabama. That's the status, that's the role that's expected. And I mentioned some statuses are ascribed and some of them are achieved. And this is really important distinction too, right? Things like that you kind of can't help, all right? Like I was born a certain race. I was born a certain gender, right? I don't think I've ever told you, but I'm a male, and and I mean that's kind of implied by husband and father and stuff like that. So you could probably guess that, and maybe my appearance as well. And those are ascribed statuses. Races are really important. Ascribed status in our society. Ethnicity as well. Gender, of course. But there are other types of statuses. They really are either ascribed or they're achieved, right? And those are things that I can't, not like ascribe where I can't help it, but they're, due to effort or achievement, right? And they can be positive or negative, right? So I think I've probably introduced myself repeatedly as Dr. Bounds, right? And that indicates to you that I have a PhD, right? That's an achieved status, right? Most of our occupations, like a professor, that's an achieved status, right? And really, our occupation is probably the most important achieved status, right? Now, some of you guys probably work and stuff. You probably had jobs, not really careers, right? And careers are more important to our identity than jobs are, right? And later, hopefully, you'll have a career, right? And your chances are better if you make good in this class and get a degree and all that kind of stuff. They really are better. I've looked at these numbers repeatedly, right? Much better. And so that's something, that's a status you're trying to achieve as a college graduate, right? And you're not there yet, but hopefully you will be, right? In a few years, or I don't know, maybe later this semester, right? Earlier I said occupation. Yeah, college students kind of like an occupation. Your major is kind of like, and there are differences between sociology majors, business majors, theater majors, music majors, and stuff like that. And there are kind of general patterns, right? In the way that they think, feel, act, dress, all sorts of things, right? And that's another example of how these statuses end up ordering social interaction in all sorts of important ways, right? And boy, we're really talking about ordinary, mundane social life, aren't we? Right? Like who you talk to each day, what you say to them, right? And what you expect from other people as well, right? When you ask someone their major, like, and they tell you one thing versus the other, like, probably. And you look at them and you see their gender and their race, and maybe you look at their clothes or the car they drive in and kind of get an idea of their class position. Then you have expectations for them. You kind of typecast them, right? Now, some of those things, they kind of be stereotypes, right? And you might be wrong sometimes, but a lot of times, when you meet a professor, he acts like a professor. He dresses like a professor. When you meet a business major, he acts like a business major. He thinks like a business major. Talks like a business major, right? And so a lot of times these expectations are met, not always, right? All right, moving on. Fundamental concepts in this chapter. There's something called role strain and role conflict, right? If I occupy two roles, father, professor, that can create a lot of conflict, let me tell you, right? There are times when I could be a much better father, but I need to be a better professor, right? And vice versa, right? So the competing demands of professor and father, right? They compete. An example that's more common, if you can't relate to me, is student athletes, right? You could be a better student, make higher grades, but probably athletics would suffer, right? You see, that's two, and vice versa, right? And all of us experience this, right? We're just one person, only so much time. We only have so much motivation and effort we can put, right? And that's role strain. Role conflict is a little bit more difficult for most students, but I'm sure you guys can get it, right? Role strain, or explain role conflict. Role strain is when there's just one status, right? And it has competing expectations, right? This is a little bit harder for people to identify, right? I have found over the years that most of my students struggle with this a little bit more. I'll give you an example of a job. Usually when people experience role strain, they don't like it. And when I've experienced in the past, I didn't like it either, right? And you often get this feeling that people describe as you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, right? And so I used to work for Department of Human Resources, DHR, right? And you may know something about this government bureaucracy and this agency, that it is their job to safeguard kids from abuse and neglect, right? But they also have another goal, and that's, if possible, to maintain the family, right? And these often are at odds with each other. They conflict with each other. They produce strain, right? When I worked for DHR, if I wanted to be absolutely certain that a kid would not be abused or neglected by the people that were taking care of them, one way of doing that is to remove them from that household, remove them from their parents, typically, right? Now, and for a long time, this is exactly what DHR did. Nowadays, because DHR recognizes that there is a certain amount of trauma, even when you remove children from abusive and neglectful parents, that produces trauma. And wherever you put them, they could get abused and neglected by different people, right? That's a real chance if you put them in a group home. That's a real chance if you put them in a foster home, right? So you're always kind of managing these two things that, if you wanted only to maintain the integrity of the family unit, right? And you weren't concerned about the other, right, thing, you'd always keep them in the house, right? And I'll tell you, I struggled with that. Everyone struggles with that when they work for DHR. When to remove children from abuse and neglectful situations, and when to keep them there. And if you keep them there, you need to put in services and monitor that family to make sure whatever caused that abuse and neglect in the past, psychological problems of mom and dad, poverty, substance abuse is often a big cause of people abusing, neglecting their kids. Some people just don't know better and they need to be sent to parenting, right? So, that's the best example that I can give, right, of role strain. You see, that is only DHR social service caseworker, right? It's only one status, but it has two competing expectations or roles, and those things conflict, right? All right. That's enough about that. Next, let's move on to the idea of a social construction, right? Social construction is something that we're going to talk about over and over again, right, in this class. This chapter introduces this idea, and it introduces an idea that's, this is kind of radical idea. And for a lot of people, when they first hear it, like, what do you mean, right? This is the idea that we actively, socially construct reality, right? Another way of saying this is we see everything, right, in this world through a cultural lens, right? Remember Sapir-Whorf hypothesis? Kind of similar idea, right? And so we are always engaged in a process of social construction of reality, right? Now, a lot of times we don't know this or conscious of it until maybe someone like myself points it out, right? And what that means is there's a process by which individuals creatively shape reality through social interaction, right? Some of those people could be way back hundreds of years ago, right? Thousands, perhaps, if you think about a language as a social construction, right? And that can sometimes be kind of lost in time. Like we don't have historical records of that, right? At least oral languages, maybe written languages we do, right? So it's socially constructed by people acting in concert with other people. And it might have started thousands of years ago, right? And it continues, and it will continue after I'm dead, you're dead, right? Yeah. It will go on, just, after I'm dead, same way it went on before I was dead, right? And you too, right? All right, so that's the social construction. Now, later in this class, we'll learn about race is a social construction, gender is a social construction, right? These are ideas by, you remember Berger, right? The very beginning of chapter 1, right? Seeing the strange and the familiar and the general and the particular, right? These are his ideas, right? He wrote a book called The Social Construction of Reality, right? All about this, right? But you might have heard those things about race as a social construction, gender as a social construction, right? And yeah, I believe that, right? Race is not a biological category, although most people think it is, right? For example, what it means to be black and what it means to be white. Those concepts were not always the same that they are now, right? In fact, really before 1500s, 1600s, someone like me wouldn't really, consider themselves white. Instead, they would think about their ethnicity, right? And now we don't, you look at someone that looks like me and you don't think about my ethnicity, right? Now, I'm Welsh, right? Now, that probably means nothing to you, and it means only a little bit more to me, right? Yeah, because all the white European ethnicities, they become white. And all their ethnicities, like whether you're Welsh or English or German or Italian, they kind of fade away, right? And the same happens for people from Africa as well, right? When people were enslaved, right? 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, for the most part, all those slaves came from Africa. And they belonged to these ethnicities, right? Tribes, right? And they didn't really think they had a lot of in common with other people that we would now recognize as black, because they taught different languages, they had different customs, right? They had different ethnicities, just like Europeans did, right? And then that fades into the background in the United States, and all of those African people become defined as black, and they kind of lose their ethnicity. Now, some of that is like forced upon them. They were, black people's ancestors, not all of them, but a good bit of them would be punished if they spoke their native language, right? And they later do kind of share one culture, right? And yeah, so that's how something like race was socially constructed over the last 500 years, right? And that's changed, right? It's not the same in 1400s and stuff like that, right? It really starts to change 1500s, 1600s, right? And long story about colonization and that kind of stuff. So, gender's the same way. You see how that with like race, like I wasn't here when they, you know, decided what it means to be white and what it means to be black. That went on before, right? Now it's changed, and it'll probably change in the future. I don't really know how, and that'll be after I'm dead, right? These are, I mean, that's like, that's a very different way of looking at reality, at race, gender, and so on, as being a social construct than the way that normally people think about it, right? So if that kind of strains your imagination, right? That's not unusual. Most people are like, social construction of reality. That's, yeah, most people. But sociologists tend to view the world like that, right? All right, moving on, right? Related to this, there's something called ethnomethodology, right? And there was a fellow named Harold Garfinkel, right? I think Harold Garfinkel's passed away, right? He was doing most of his important work. Earlier in my life, right? Let's say that, right? If he is still alive, he is probably quite old, right? I suppose I could satisfy my curiosity. He died. Oh, sorry about that, right? He died in 2011, right? And he was born in 1917. Wow, you know, pretty long life, wasn't it, right? Harold Garfinkel had a theory, kind of like, you know, called ethnomethodology, where he studied the way that people made sense of their everyday surroundings. And a big part of this is what they call breaching experiments, where Garfinkel and his sociology students, graduate and undergraduate students, right, he would encourage them to go out into society and violate norms. Now, not, you know, real significant norms. Like, he didn't have people, you know, go out and rob people or murder people or something like that. That would get them in trouble. But these norms that are often unspoken, right? Let me give you some examples, right? He would have his students go into public bathrooms, right? And particularly for men, there are all these unspoken norms, right? So, you know, you go into a large bathroom that has maybe 5 or 6 urinals, right? And I'm imagining that most females have, you know, at least seen in a public bathroom with multiple urinals, right? And if you walk in and you're a male and one person is on the urinal to the far left, it's an unspoken norm that you do not go to the urinal that's closest to them, right? You put some space between you. If you do, people will look at you weird, right? They might even say, give me some space, buddy, right? And like, I don't know if people taught me this or I just kind of, you know, and I don't know how other people learned it either, but we all learn it, right? That's one breaching experiment, right? Here's another one, right? Doesn't involve bathrooms, right? And when people walk into an elevator, that puts them in contact with other people typically they don't know, right? And there are unspoken norms about how to be a passenger on an elevator, right? You walk in, you turn around, and you look up at the numbers as the numbers change, right? And he would have his students violate those expectations, right? So imagine you're in an elevator, you know, rather than looking at the numbers, there's someone standing there, you stare them intensely into their face, right? You're violating that norm, right? Those are breaching experiments, right? And there's a lot of those that Erving Goffman did, and they're supposed to reveal how people make sense and how norms are socially constructed. Some often, though, they're unspoken, right? And no one punishes you most of the time, right? If you look intensely in other people's eyes rather than staring at the numbers in the elevator. But you know who doesn't know these norms, I've noticed? Young children. So you get in the elevator, like all the little kids, so like, you look down at them, they're like, staring you in the eyes like, kid, look over there. Don't stop staring at me, right? And I guess at some point, maybe their parents tell them don't stare at people in the elevator. They kind of figure it out, right? And a lot of this is like kind of body language and what are you doing? Stop looking at me and stuff. They don't even say stuff. It's just like, if someone's making me nervous, too close or making eye contact, I avert my eyes and you look in the elevator when you get a little bit older than the kids, you're like, oh, everybody's looking up there. I'm going to look up there, right? You conform, right? All right, that's Harold Garfinkel. He does a number of these breaching experiments, some in the classroom and stuff, and I've done some of those in the classroom. Come in the classroom rather than looking at your audience in the classroom and making eye contact. You turn around and you face the wall and give, your lecture this far from the wall. And people are like, what are you doing, Dr. Bounds, right? Is he trying to make some point or has he lost his mind, right? And usually after a few minutes, I stop doing that because it makes me really uncomfortable to break those norms. And I hear people kind of laughing behind me and stuff like that, right? So there's this unspoken norm. When a teacher or a professor walks into a class, they're going to stand at the front of the class. The students are going to sit in their seats, and they're going to look at each other when they talk to each other. And the professor is going to do most of the talking, right? So another preaching experiment that Harold Garfinkel, he would do that himself, and then he would have graduate students, probably that were teaching classes, do it in their classes, right? And kind of report back to him, right? Pretty interesting stuff, right? He's intentionally violating norms, right? And you might remember earlier when we talked about norms, like, how do you know a norm exists? You violate it and see if you're sanctioned, right? So, that in that breaching experience, you violate it. If you get sanctioned, if people look at you weird, if they think, if they laugh, right? If they go get the chair of your department and say, Dr. Bounds lost his mind, he's giving a lecture to the wall, those are sanctions, right? And I would have to explain that to my chair while I was doing that. And I was making an intellectual point about Harold Garfinkel's work. And if I didn't account for that information, for what Garfinkel says, then I'm not explaining it in a way, then maybe I will receive some sanctions, right? If I can't explain it away to my boss and the dean and the president and stuff like that, they're like, no, Dr. Bounds lost his mind. We might need to terminate his employment or something like that, right? But I would explain it to him. I would account for myself, and I would explain that I was just covering Harold Garfinkel's work in breaching experiments. All right. The next thing that we're going to talk about, and earlier I said this name by accident. Now we're going to talk about Erving Goffman, right? I guess because they both start with a G, I was going to, Garfinkel is the breaching experiments and ethnomethodology. Goffman, Erving Goffman, who we discussed earlier in relationship, in an earlier chapter in relationship to total institutions and resocialization, that's the same Goffman, right? And he's not young, right? He's actually dead too, right? And I think he died in the early 80s, So, I don't know. I like to situate these people in time. And, that was kind of the first 10 years of my life. I was born in 1972. So he's not a long time ago, like Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, or Max Weber, or something like that. He is considered a contemporary sociologist, right? Now, he was a student of George Herbert Mead, right, that we talked about in an earlier chapter. And that should probably tell you, of those three theoretical approaches, structural functionalism, conflict approach, and symbolic interaction. Remember, George Herbert Mead is a symbolic interactionist. That should tell you, and I also told you he was a student of Mead, that he's a symbolic interactionist too, right? And you remember all that stuff about Cooley's looking glass self, and Mead argued that we present ourselves to other people and we look in their faces like they're a mirror, and that's what Cooley's looking glass self is all about. So Goffman agrees with all that, and he builds upon those earlier ideas or theories, right? And so here's how this goes. He kind of takes it to a new notch, there's levels to this, right? Cooley, Mead, Goffman, right? And they're kind of building upon each other, right? You often see this. And often it is the case that older person, student, right? The student becomes older. They teach another person, right? That you're definitely seeing that with Cooley, Mead, Erving Goffman. And there's even some other younger people like my age that were kind of heavily influenced by Goffman. So these are big ideas in the field, right? And he wrote a book called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. Remember when I said that we're going to talk about everyday mundane life, right? And this is a big part of it, right? In that book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, he quotes from Shakespeare, right? And at the very beginning of that book, right? And I don't often quote from Shakespeare, right? And but these are some of Shakespeare's most, you've heard these ideas before, right? Even if you don't quote from Shakespeare very often either, right? And these words are all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. I'll stop there. It keeps going, right? Goffman takes that analogy that Shakespeare used, right? Basically, Shakespeare's saying as we live our normal, everyday, mundane life, we are like actors on a play. We have our entrances, we have our exits. We perform statuses or roles. We perform roles is how most people would put it, right? We call those statuses, right? They play many parts. I talked about in my life, I've played the part of a son. I've played the part of a father. Maybe one day I'll be a grandfather, right? Hopefully not anytime soon because I have 8 and 10-year-old, right? I wasn't always a professor. I told you I used to work at DHR as a social service caseworker, right? That's, every one of those jobs, every one of those statuses, son, father, right, citizen, so on, Christian, right? I'm playing a role, right? I happen to have a prop. And even that, right? If you're in a play, right? Some of you will really like this if you're a theater major, right? In a play, you have props, right? I just happen to have a cap. Have y'all ever heard of this way of thinking about I wear many caps, right? You know, I just throw my hats and caps down on my desk when I get in and stuff like that. But like, you know, I go pick up my kids, I put on the dad hat, right? You know, later in about a month, I'll start coaching baseball, right? And I will wear this hat, right? And that will identify me as the coach because none of the other adults present, you know, will have one of those caps. I might give some to the assistant coaches and stuff like that, right? So this idea that like people wear many caps, people play many roles. One man in his time plays many parts, right? So this is what Goffman calls dramaturgical analysis. It is this analogy that Shakespeare came up with, that we are actors on the stage. And when I'm an actor on stage, like I'm an actor on the stage right now, I'm presenting an image of myself as a professor. I'm talking about other things I do, coach, father, son, so on, other statuses that I occupy. Some of them I used to occupy, like the HR worker, right? And right now I'm performing the role or status of a professor, right? And when I do that, I am dressed the part today. I have a faculty meeting I have to go to later today. And when I have to go to those things, I dress a little bit nicer than you've probably seen in some of these videos, right? I dress, and I think I dress, and I'm pretty sure that I do, like a professor, right? A professional, right? You know, collar, right? Button-up shirt, right? So I have a costume, right? There was a dress code for me when I worked for DHR. You know, I've had other jobs where you wear an actual uniform or something like that, right? And you know, this is a setting, right? My house is a setting, right? If I was teaching this face to face, the setting would be the actual classroom, right? I have props, right? I have reading glasses, right? Do I suddenly look more like a professor? I think so, right? The weird thing about this is like kind of makes you really self-conscious about how you're acting and whether you're right. And Goffman talks about I was really self-conscious when I first started becoming a professor. I thought a lot about the way that I was presenting. But you know what? I've been teaching college for 20 years and it's kind of second nature now, right? And yeah. But I'm still using props and I'm still wearing a costume and I'm still adhering to the norms of what a college professor does. I think I am, right? They keep, giving me raises and promotions and, paychecks keep coming and stuff. So I must not be failing at it horribly, right? I'll let you be the judge of that. But I've had some success in meeting those expectations, right? When we present an image of ourselves, when we're an actor upon the stage, as Shakespeare and as Goffman said, the people that we present that image to are the audience, right? I'm carefully controlling the impressions that I make upon people, right? I'm not, just acting in any way that I want to, right? I'm acting like a professor, right? Now, when you go to work, depending on what your job is, you will, I don't know, if you work at McDonald's or wait tables or something like that, you will, you know, dress up in a McDonald's costume, right? Or uniform is what we typically call that. And you will probably say things like, "Welcome to McDonald's. Can I take your order?" You'll say that thousands of times, right? Every day. And would you like fries with that and stuff, right? You see that, you're presenting an image and you're carefully controlling the impressions that people have of you, right? And we're all doing this, is the point that Goffman's making. And we're doing this all the time, whether we're conscious of it or not. Now that I've told you that and explained that, you're going, I'm more conscious of it than I used to, right? That's dramaturgical analysis. And, that's if everything goes the way you want it to go, right? Now, sometimes people do not live up to the expectations of others when they're presenting an image of themselves, particularly when they first start, right? So, if you just got a job waiting tables, it's your first day, you might stutter, you might appear nervous, right? You might be at a loss of words. Same is true for professors, right? When I first started teaching, sometimes I stutter, right? I stuttered more, right? And when the image that you're presenting or attempting to present is different than what the audience receives, right? So like I'm supposed to be, as a professor, smart, knowledgeable, articulate, right? And so if I go into a face-to-face classroom and I can't remember anyone's name, like I can't remember Emil Durkheim and Irving Goffman and stuff like that, that's not a good performance of that role at all. Or if you're McDonald's, I like, welcome to Burger King. I was like, oh no, that's where I used to have a job, right? Or something like that. And when that happens, you're going to experience embarrassment, right? Embarrassment is when the image that you're attempting to present, you don't present it, but you present some, failed version of that. You don't live up to the expectations, right? Yeah. So that's where embarrassment. That's how Goffman explains embarrassment, right? Now, luckily, right? You know how like in theater, like the show must go on, right? And really, audiences or the people that we interact with at work or, in our normal everyday lives, when we fail to present a favorable image of ourselves, they don't say, aha, I knew you were a fraud, right? In fact, when I couldn't remember names, when I stuttered, when I was kind of silent, but when I first started teaching, students would help me. They would help the professor because they would see that I was struggling. I assume they kind of liked me, and they would be embarrassed for me, right? Sometimes, right? I mean, this wasn't horrible. It didn't happen constantly and stuff like that, but it did occasionally happen, and that's how audience typically are, right? They help in the production of the play, right? Just like in a real play, if you forget your lines and you just stand there, right? Someone's going to help you out. It might be someone off stage, like, here's your line. So yell out the first few words of your line and get you going or something like that. Or another actor whispered under their voice so you can hear it, right? Someone in the audience could do that, right? Yeah. I don't know. That's Erving Goffman. That's dramaturgical analysis, right? It just uses this analogy of theater, and it says all of social life is like that, right? And I gave you examples of my work, your work. You can analyze if you're McDonald's workers waiting tables or anything like that, right? If you ever waited tables like in a formal restaurant, right? I never have, but I've known people, friends, past girlfriends and stuff that waited tables when I was younger, and like really like formal places where your costume would be a tie and stuff like that, right? Expensive restaurants, right? And I was kind of, as a sociologist, I was kind of interested in this, and so what happens when they train people is often in the kitchen or somewhere out of sight in the backstage is what Goffman would call it. They have a mock table, right? And on that table, they set out all the silverware, the plates, and where different glasses go, right? And then they, good evening, welcome to this restaurant, right? Now they're not saying that to a student. Maybe they have people, sitting there. There are other waiters, but they're performing the role of that's his students, performing the role of a customer, right? And then they'll tell them what the specials are, right? And then they'll ask the women first what they would like to order, right? I mean, I guess before that, you ask them their drink order, right? And then you give them some time to look at the menu after you discuss the specials, and then you come back and take their entree, I never waited tables, so I get the order of all this mixed up, right? But you get the point, right? Hopefully, I'm sure most of y'all have been to a kind of more formal restaurant, right? There's a lot of social order, right? And people perform those, they rehearse those roles in the backstage, right? Now another thing about the backstage is all the other people. The backstage is where the presentation of self does not occur. This is the front stage where that occurs. See how I'm drawing out this analogy of Shakespeare's and of Goffman's. And when people, Goffman says, when people share a backstage, this is true of a real backstage, but it's also true of like the restaurant and the waiters and the cooks and the busboys and stuff like that. This is, you walk out of the front stage, the dining room, right, where all the customers are. You walk through that door, and as soon as they walk through this door, they often exhale, right? Now I can stop presenting this image of myself and I can relax, right? And I can kind of let down my guard, be my more authentic self, we might say, right? And when people share backstage, that often means they form really close emotional contact, emotional relationships with people, right? That's true of waiters and waitresses. That's true of professors, right? That's true of teachers when they go to the teacher's lounge, right? That's true of McDonald's when they walk to the back and they, complain about these customers and stuff like that, right? People share a back stage, right? Often, it's kind of like you have this common experience, you relate to each other, and people make, in those conditions of the backstage, you make really strong. I mean, this happens in real theater too, right? If you've ever been part of a play, you know that after that first performance or two, everyone, if those performances went well, they're all pleased with each other. They like each other more. You've Yeah, you've shared it backstage. You've had this common experience, and you've presented yourself to the audience, and you've, you know, if it's a play, to borrow some terminology from before, you have socially constructed reality for an audience, right? I don't know. I'm trying to think of famous plays and stuff like that. Yeah, goodness. Well, I mean, I guess we talk about any Shakespeare play, right? Now, those people on the stage are not, I don't know, really the roles in a Shakespeare play or Romeo and Juliet, but they're presenting that image of Romeo and Juliet. And they're rehearsing that in the backstage. And if they have a successful performance, they've socially constructed. The idea that Kaufman has is like, man, he even talks about this. Like, aren't we all just con artists anyway? We present ourselves and like it's not our authentic self, right? It's this attempt to manage people's impressions, right? Yeah. I don't know. Another interesting example is going to a job interview. You know, when I go on job interviews, I don't be my authentic self, right? No, not at all. I manage my impressions. I dress up. I comb my hair, and maybe I get a haircut before then, right? And you know, I don't use all the slang that I do when I talk to my friends. You know, it's like the King's English or the Queen's English, right? And if I do well in that interview, I'll be rewarded with the job, right? And if I don't, I won't get that job, right? Sanctions again, right? All right, that's serving God. That's really the most important theory in this chapter. Trying to kind of, you know, look at some of these other things and make some decisions about what needs to be said in the remaining time and what I can skip. There's some, oh boy, there's a lot of interesting stuff that I should probably briefly mention, right? There's discussion about personal space, right? This is often called the field of proximatics, right? How close we come to each other, right? That depends on our relationship with other people, right? If I had my wife here, you would not be surprised if I touched her on the arm, if I gave her a hug, right? Same with my daughter, same with my son. And you've probably seen that as they've interrupted these videos, right? But if you came to one of my face-to-face contacts, I don't touch students, not even on the shoulder, right? I mean, there might have been times if someone told me that someone died and they were crying, and I might pat them on the back or something like that. But generally speaking, like intimate relationships, it's acceptable, right, to touch. But professional relationships, not, no, right? Generally not, right? And if I, don't observe those expectations, boy, yeah, I don't even like to think about it, right? So, the more intimate you are, then people share personal space, right? But you shouldn't be real intimate, right? Doctors shouldn't be real intimate with patients. Now, they have to touch them, right? And that's, but they touch them in a certain way. And pediatricians, I'm going to touch you, and the reason why I'm going to touch you is this, right? Don't let other people touch you this way, right? And if they do, tell someone, right? And, good pediatricians are like, I'm going to do this. Is it okay? They're gaining the consent of that child and probably the parent as well, right? Um, so, like if you pass by strangers on the street, you usually keep a fairly good distance, right? Now, if you introduce yourselves, you might shake hands, right? That's an example, yeah, with a stranger. But nowadays, a lot of people don't like to shake hands. But if you met someone, you hit it off with them, you became closer friends, then you would get closer to them in terms of approximate distance, right? And you can, go to a crowded place, cafeteria, airport or something, do some people watching. And just based upon how close they are, you can probably guess the relationship that they have. Like it's not hard to tell. Kids are sitting on people's laps and stuff like that, and they're kids touching the parent, and the parent's touching the kid, and it's like, oh yeah, that's a family, right? And then you'll see other couples, and there's a romantic couple, right? I don't know if they're dating, but they're a romantic couple, right? You can do all of that without hearing any of the conversation, just looking at how close they are to each other, right? Yeah. Oh boy, it's kind of interesting also to think about like dating and how strangers might become more intimate, right? And I'm sure we've all kind of gone through this before. You don't really know someone, but you date and you get more, and at some point there's like someone takes the other person's hand, right? That's the direct contact, right? And when you do that, you're looking to see if that person is receptive or not. Do they hold your hand, or do they, pull their hand away, right? And then there's, in romantic relationships, there's, kissing, right? And are people reciprocating, right? Are they giving you consent to kiss, as well as even more intimate acts than that, right? And if those things don't happen and people don't reciprocate, right? Holding hands, right? Hugging, kissing, then that person's not interested, and you break that. You go back to previous distances that you put, and that kind of lets the person know, like, we're going to be friends, or we're going to be acquaintances. We're not going to be romantic partners, right? And that's all, proximate space to each other. And we all kind of navigate that, and it's really interesting. We don't often talk about it, right? And we look for reciprocation. I held their hands. Later, they're going to want to hold my hand, right? That's reciprocation. I kissed them. They made the first move. They're going to later kiss me back, right? And is that kiss going to become, I don't know, more passionate and stuff like that, right? That's how, moving from strangers to, first date, right? Now, it doesn't always, result. Sometimes it's like, first date, no, right? Or, a few dates, we held hands, perhaps you kissed the person, but then, kind of, that was that, right? Yeah. But I think about, dating my wife, right? She reciprocated, right? And, and we grew more serious, and we, began to share personal space, right? And continue to, right? And that's the intimacy of personal space, right? All right. lots of, staring, smiling, extended eye contact that goes on, right? All these, kind of subtle cues in this kind of back and forth social interaction between people. And some people are good at that, and some people are bad at that. The people that are bad at that, if they don't gain consent, it could be the state that sanctions them to prison and stuff like that, right? It could just be, people talk about, this guy's too handsy, right? Don't date him. What a weirdo and stuff like that, right? It's all handsy, right? You don't know me like that. Don't place your hands on me, right? And so we all know examples of people that have violated some of those norms in terms of touching and personal space and stuff like that. Yeah. And when they violate those expectations, what happens? They get sanctioned, right? How do you know a norm exists? Because people sanction it. All right. So that's kind of proximetics and social distance between people. I also want to say a little bit about body language. I've kind of hit upon this already. Body language versus speech, right? When people present an image of themselves, most people are fairly good at picking the correct words that come out of their mouth, right? We all kind of think about, what am I going to say, and things like that, right? People are not as skilled at controlling their body language and their gestures, right? Like I do this stuff, and and right, I do all these gestures, and I'm not really thinking very consciously about those, right? And most people are not either. And this is why people can lie to you, and they can be pretty good at lying to you because they're carefully picking their words. But if you look at their body language can tell you, this person's lying to me, right? And that's because it's much more difficult to control your body language, right? Yeah, it is much more difficult, right? If you believe someone's lying to you, ask them. You're not lying to me, are you? Right? And a lot of times their body language will tense up, right? That's unconscious, that tension, right? A lot of times they will avert their eyes, right? And what do you mean your eye, right? This is the body, look down with their shoes, look anywhere but your eyes, right? Now, some people that are, more skilled at lying, they might look down, then they'll make eye contact with you because they know, that's a telltale sign. But then they might make too much eye contact with you to compensate looking at their shoes or looking away, right? All of these things are kind of telltale signs. Here's another thing. When if you have someone that they're lying to you and believe they're lying to them, they will also do. That's a defensive position, right? You're putting space in your arms in a defensive position, right? That doesn't always tell you, right? But with other things, right? Like the eye contact with the bodily gestures, right? That's a defensive bodily position. This is an open, in the smile, right? I'm a faithful husband, right? And if my wife was to ask, you ever cheated on me? No, I've never thought about that, right? And I would not go like this, right? It would not make me nervous. I would not tense up, right? I would not avert my eyes, right? In fact, I was like, you don't have anything to worry about that. Hug her, right? It's open arms, right? The opposite of this, right? Would not avert my eyes. So I've not had anything, no reason to avert my eyes, right? And I would reassure her, right? That I don't, I don't know where this is coming from. I don't know why you're anxious about this, but you have nothing to worry about, right? My body language would be totally different. That's because I wouldn't have to lie to her, right? Yeah. It's hard. It's much harder to hide body language than it is to pick the correct words. And we kind of all know this, right? Easy for people to lie. Much more difficult to control their body language because a lot of that is subconscious, right? And I'm a criminologist, and there are people, body language experts, that will look at people accused of crime as they're being interrogated. And some detectives are quite good at this too, right? And it's not admissible in court, but you can get a pretty darn good idea if the person's lying to you or not, right? Yeah. And you can further investigate. But if you believe that, looks like they're telling me they didn't do it, their body language, they didn't do it, well, I need to go look at other people, right? Because they probably really didn't do it, right? Yeah. So that's in crime investigations, body language versus what people say. That's really important. I mean, we're all kind of, trying to figure out if people are lying to us or not all the time, right? Yeah. I think that's everything I have to say, right? It's been I've lasted over an hour and 10 minutes, and hopefully next chapter will be much shorter, but I'm trying to hit all the main ideas and give examples and stuff like that, and I hope that you're enjoying these videos. Yeah. And maybe I should remind you, if you're not enjoying these videos, there's another way of learning this material where you don't have to hear me explain it, right? And that's just read the textbook, look over the PowerPoints. And some students will choose to do that. But some of you might like looking at my face, or you might think I help you learn this material. And that's why I keep making these videos, right? And I hope it is helping a lot of y'all. And next week, when we cover chapter 5, I'll make the video a good bit shorter. All right. Y'all have a nice day.